Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. I have a couple games that I think are good to review to help everybody learn. Sometimes I notice that people watch fewer of my videos when it's a game video than they do for, let's say, hoop chess or how to think. Okay, well, I understand that, but when people ask me, how do I learn openings? How do I learn strategy? How do I learn tactics? How do I learn middle game? How do I learn endgame? How do I transition into the endgame? There's one kind of video, there's one kind of book that contains all of that, and that's games. Games have all those things. If they're well annotated games, you learn about every single aspect of chess. So for those of you that think, game videos, they're probably less interesting, then you might want to rethink that. And also, there's also the question of grandmaster games, top grandmaster games versus amateur games. Well, obviously you want to go over a lot of grandmaster games, but you want to also look at some games where the people aren't perfectly, good, to see what kind of mistakes they make and how to take advantage of them. Now, it's funny how people kind of put in their mind the difference between grandmasters and beginners. They think, well, I don't want to see people putting pieces on prees. Well, there's a lot of in between. There's people that are awfully good that are not beginners, but they're not grandmasters. I mean, I fall into that category. So today we're going to look at a game that was played at a high level in a high level tournament, but it's not a grandmaster tournament, even though grandmasters play. We're going to look at the final two rounds of the North American Corporate Chess League, which was played online and just finished this week. And there were 43 corporation teams playing, high-powered teams like Google and IBM and Capital One and so on. And there was some very strong players playing. If we go to this is the team standings. If we go to the individual standings, you can see that the number one player in the tournament was Grandmaster Ashwin Jairam. And we can see if we look at the top players here, most of these players are rated over 2,200. There were a total of 415 players playing, all the way down to about, obviously to unrated level players. So it was Grandmaster all the way down toward beginner. So my son was playing for the Susquehanna International Group team, which was in contention for first place into the last couple rounds. Let's look at again for the standings for team standings. Susquehanna International Group was fighting with Deloitte and Wells Fargo for first place. Qualcomm was in toward fourth. So let's take a look at a game from the next to the last round. Let's go over to my board here. All right, so my son is black and he's playing against a national master who's white. So let's take a look at the game. All right, let's see here. Hold on a second. All right, white plays d4, black plays knight f6, c4, g6. That could become a king's Indian if black plays bishop g7. A Grunfeld if he plays d5. Knight c3. These days at the grandmaster level, the Grunfeld is much more popular. So if this was a grandmaster game, I would expect black to play d5. Delen plays king's Indian, perfectly good. Opening, not as popular now at the top grandmaster level. White plays e4, threatening e5. Black plays d6. White plays f3. That's the Simich attack, where you usually play bishop e3, queen d2, castle queen side, and attack the king side. It's a little bit similar to the Dragon Sicilian. Black should castle. Bishop e3. And now the grandmaster move that has kind of put this opening on its heels is to play c5 and sacrifice a pawn. And it turns out black gets full compensation for the pawn. If you watched my video I played a few weeks ago against the engine, the mid-level engine, I play the e5 line where I sacked my queen for a couple pieces and a couple pawns, and I won that game, but the computers don't like the queen sacrifice variation that much anymore. My son plays a third move, which is perfectly playable. He plays knight to a6. The idea of knight a6, as you'll see in a couple minutes, is to reposition the knight so it can help break up the white center. All right, so white plays the normal queen to d2, and my son plays c5. And now white has a choice of what he wants to do. He can close the center. He could keep the tension with knight ge2. He can, well, taking the pawn doesn't make a lot of sense. That would just help the knight come toward the middle. So white plays d5. All right, so now there's two break moves for black. Black has to break open the center. A break move is a pawn move that attacks a fixed pawn that can't go past. So b5 is a break move. Right now b5 is not safe. And e6 is a break move. My son plays the safe break move, e6. And white blunders and plays bishop h6. So this is the only move of the game that I can, black would criticize himself here. In a speed game, I might miss this too, but I've seen this trap. This is black to play and win, basically. So if you want to pause the video and see if you can find it, black to play and win. Okay, the answer is this bishop is guarded once and attacked once. If you can attack it a second time with tempo, you can win. So what you do is you play knight takes e4, a surprising move. So clearly white can't play bishop takes g7 because of knight takes d2, winning the queen. But if white saves the queen by, let's say, taking the knight, knight takes e4, then queen h4 check, hits the bishop a second time, and when white gets out of check, then black can simply play queen takes h6, and black has won a pawn and the bishop pair, and, this is a winning position for black. So white fell into this opening trap, but unfortunately Delen didn't see it. All right, so let's go back to the game because the rest of the game is pretty high quality. All right, black takes the pawn first. This gives white time to trade off the bishop before the queen check can come in. So white does, he takes the bishop. That's the most accurate move rather than recapturing the center, which would allow the same kind of tactic. And after black recaptures, white takes toward the center. White now has two center pawns, black only has one, but black has a 3-on-2 majority on the queen side. All right, so here black plays a thematic move. He plays knight to c7. What's also interesting here is when my son was very young, he would always play like knight bd7 here. And a lot of my students do this too, with the idea that it supports c5 and e5. But this gives you redundant knights. It blocks the bishop. And the knight on c5, once he supports the break moves, has no future. And in fact, sometimes my son would play something like, let's play bishop d3, e5, d5. He'd play like knight b6, which is a really terrible place for the knight. So I used to call the knight to b6 move in the King's Indian the Delen maneuver because he would do this. But in this game, he does it much, much, much better. Let's go back to what he did. In this game, the knight is going to be much better. Pawn takes, knight c7. Now you might say, well, it takes two moves to go to c7. You can get to d7 in one. But the nice thing about knight to c7 is it supports the queenside majority rolling up the board, which is exactly what black absolutely has to do here. The knight on d7, even though it would save a tempo, doesn't do that. So the knight on c7, which looks a little strange if you haven't seen a lot of King's Indians, or Benonis in this case, it's more like a Benoni, is a really good spot for the knight. If we ask the engine now to evaluate this position, let's turn on Stockfish 12 here. It says white has a nice advantage. Black missed that chance to win the pawn. And we know that engines don't like King's Indian positions and they don't like Benonis that much. So black has a typical kind of Benoni position, but Benonis are not the number one defense. So even though it's 0.5, it's certainly playable. It's not very popular at the Grandmaster level, but it's a game. All right, so the master plays bishop to d3, getting ready to play knight ge2 and castle kingside now, I think. And black plays rook e8, putting the rook on the semi-open file. White develops his knight. Again, back to the kind of move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Bishop d7. Now black has enough pieces to threaten b5. And white's a master. He certainly would know that normally you play a4 here. So I was very surprised when he didn't do that. Stockfish doesn't think that a4 is absolutely forced, but at a human level, you would think stopping black from expanding on the queen side is a good idea. So I would play a4 here for white. If we look at the top 3 moves, let's do that. So Stockfish has g4, castle, a4. Now it's g4. Yeah, g4, castle, knight d1. So a4 is close to the top 3, but it's not clearly number 1. Right now it's not even in the top 3. He likes this kind of pawn thrust here with g4 as clearly the best move. Trying to take advantage of the awkwardness of the knight on f6. All right, let's turn off the engine for the moment. So white plays just castle. And I'm sure Delen was happy to see that, and now he gets b5 in, and now black has easy play on the queen side with his mobile majority in the middle game. White gets ready to push his f-pawn and then his e-pawn, so it's a race now. It's a race between white pushing like f4 and e5 and black playing the queen side pawns. So black says, all right, well, I'll hit the bishop. He's not trying to, do anything other than gain more space on the queen side. Bishop goes back to c2. a5. Again, the pawn majority must roll. When you have a majority, you got to get it going. White knows that too. That's why he's going to play f4 and try for e5 at some point soon. He plays knight d4 first, keeping an eye on these weak light squares here. Black says, go away, Mr. Knight. Now what the knight wants to do is go to d1 and then maybe to e3 and support the central break. So the master plays knight to d1, and my son says, all right, let's trade off my c7 knight for your d4 knight, and that would also get my bishop onto a better diagonal. And I'm a little bit cramped, so trading off that good knight is a good idea. So good move by black. White decides to take. The bishop takes, now threatening maybe c3 in some lines, which hits the queen and hits the rook. White plays queen d4, pinning the knight to the king. The knight would love to go to d7 and into these weak dark squares, but he's pinned. So black says, all right, my king's done his work on g7. Let me get out of the pin so I can use my knight. You don't want to wait till you're in trouble when you're in a pin like that. You want to get out of it as soon as you can to make sure that you're not only can your pieces move, but you don't fall into any tactics. And right now, of course, the knight is perfectly well defended. White plays knight to e3, hitting the c-pawn for the second time. Black activates the rook and guards the pawn on c4. The chances at this point, I think, are relatively even. Let's ask Stockfish. Stockfish, what do you got? Stockfish says, no, they're not. They said black's better by about half a pawn here. Okay, so Delen's been doing well. He's been playing the early middle game well. Easier position to play for black. White plays rook f2 to avoid these c3 discoveries. But again, now his attack with f4 and e5 here is slower. And the more time he gives black on the queen side, the better it is for black. All right, black repositions the knight going into one of these two squares depending on what white does. For instance, if white plays f4, obviously the knight's not going to go to e5. And also getting ready to push the queen side pawns. So white feels like he has to do something here, and he does play f4. So the good news is his pawns are rolling. He can play f5 and attack toward the king side. He can play e5 and attack in the center. The bad news is the e4 pawn has lost some of its support, so he has to watch that, because when the knight goes to c5, it's going to be attacked twice and guarded twice, and that's going to tie up white's pieces to guarding the e4 square. So Delen plays, before he moves the knight, he plays queen to b6 and says, ooh, this is a really good diagonal. You've got a knight on it, you've got a rook on it, you got your king on it. If you don't trade queens, then I'm going to have a lot of pressure on that diagonal. And if you do trade queens, then my knight is going to help the queenside pawns come up the board. And we're now in an endgame where your extra pressure in the center and the king side is not likely to checkmate me. So that's a good strategic move. So white decides to trade queens. Obviously, knight takes is forced. And now black's got his mobile majority coming down the queen side. He's also got some pressure on that e4 pawn. And meanwhile, white has to be a little careful here. For instance, I guess if he plays knight to g4, threatening to fork, I don't know. Can black play knight takes d5 because the rook's not guarded? I'm not sure he can, because white can just guard the rook and then threaten to take off the knight and then threaten the fork. So I don't think knight takes d5 is safe here. What I'm saying is if knight takes d5, let's say white just saves the rook. Let's say he plays, I don't know, rook to d1 maybe, hitting the knight. Oh, well, and see, now the knight can't go to e3. I guess black could try h5 here. Hitting the knight so that if he... No, because rook takes d5, h takes g, rook takes b5. And if black tries bishop to c6, then white has knight f6 check, winning, I think. So, yeah, I could check that with the engine, but it's not necessary. So I don't think knight takes d5 is going to be a threat anytime quite soon, but white still has to watch out for that idea. All right, so let's go back to the game. In the game, white did play knight to g4, so we just saw that knight takes d5 doesn't work. In fact, let's have the engine prove that. Knight takes d5. Stockfish says yes. Rook to d1. Then it gives c3. Rook takes d5. C takes b2. Knight checks. This is a crazy line. King h8. Now rook to d1 to stop from queening. Rook e6 hitting the knight. Black's down a piece. Knight to d5. a4. Knight takes b4. a3. Rook on f to d2. And it says the game is even. Black's protected passed pawn in the 7th rank makes up for the fact that he's down a piece. Huh. Well, that's not a very human line, but it's interesting. All right, back to the game. So my son plays a much better move. In fact, he plays the best move. Knight takes d5 is very dangerous. So let's make the board back to full size. King g7. The king's done a good job. First he captured on g7. Then he went out of the pin. Now he stops the fork. Okay, so white plays rook to d1, I guess with the idea to now to stop knight takes d5. And black says b3. Well, at first glance you might say, hey, the safety table tells you that pawn's not safe. White can just win a pawn. The problem is the bishop on c2 is overworked. He's guarding the central pawn. So if he takes the side pawn and gets rid of the majority, he loses the central pawn and white's center kind of falls apart. And black has much the better pieces here. So white's a little bit between a rock and a hard place here. He does trade the pawns, but he decides to keep the bishop guarding the pawn. But white's in some big trouble now. White plays bishop to b1, not the greatest square in the world. All right, now all black has to do is get his knight into the game, and he does. He plays knight c4. Now black has a big threat. He's threatening h5, trapping the knight. The knight can't go to h6, he can't go to f6, he can't go to e5, e3 is guarded, can't go to f2, can't go to h2. So white has to do something about the threat. And there's not a lot of good moves he can play. He can move the rook and bring the knight back. He tries something to counterattack by hitting the knight that would guard that square. But after bishop to d3, black can play h5 anyway, forcing white to take on c4. So h5, and now bishop takes c4 is forced because he can't play knight e3 because after knight takes e3, bishop takes b5, knight takes d1, bishop takes e8, knight takes f2. This is what I call a counting sequence. And at the end of this counting sequence, let's say white tries bishop to d7, black just plays rook to c7, and black's up an entire rook here. So due to that counting sequence, knight e3 is not possible. So the only move that white can play to give his knight that square is bishop takes c4. But then at the end of that, the bishop is no longer guarding e4, and e4 falls for nothing, and white's just getting killed. So bishop takes, rook takes, knight hits the rook, and the rook says, thanks for the pawn. And now white can't even guard the knight, he has to move it. Well, again, he has the problem. He can't go to c4, he can't go to f5, he can't go to c2, he can't go to d1, he can't go to g2, he can't go to g4, he can't go to d5, so he has to play knight to f1. Well, then black simply says, okay, but I'm winning. I can simultaneously trade rooks and put you in a bind by pinning the knight. And there's nothing white can do. He's down a pawn, he's losing more material, and he's got to trade things off. So he moves the rook away from the knight. Let's see what would have happened if he hadn't done that. Suppose he would have played rook takes, and now he needs to be able to move the king out of the pin or else he can't move at all. So let's say he plays g3. Black will simply play a4. White will move out of the pin. And now black just trades everything off. Rook takes f1, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1 check, king takes f1, and now we sacrifice the a pawn with a3, and it doesn't matter what white plays. B takes, b2, a4, b1 queen, resigns, right? So that's the problem that white has, is black's got him in a bind. If instead white plays, let's say, rook on d to d2. Okay, so now, let's see, what's the easiest? We could still play that move a4, getting ready to play a3 later. Let's ask Stockfish what he would do in this position if rook had gone to d2. Mr. Stockfish, what do you want to play here? Stockfish says, I want to stop him from getting out of the bind with g3. So he plays the clever move h4. Now the idea is if g3, he can play h3, and the king can never move out of the pin. So white's going to be running out of moves really fast. Very nice move by the engine. If white tries to stop after h4, if he tries to stop him with h3, then g3 is not going to be guarded. So for instance here, suppose white tries to play, I don't know what he can play. He's really got problems. He really is running out of moves. Let's say he plays rook to d4. Oh, sorry, it's black's turn. Black can play rook on 8 to e4, stopping rook d4. Well, that'll do it. So now what could white play? Well, white can move the rook back and forth. Rook f3, a4, rook f2, king f6. Black can just slowly improve the position. Rook f3, doesn't have any other moves. Rook b1, getting ready to double rooks on the knight. And now if white doubles his rooks, black plays here, and white's in Susquehanna. He doesn't have any moves on the whole board. If he moves the king away from the knight, he loses the knight. If he moves a rook away from the knight, he loses the knight. If he plays g3, black takes, and if he takes back, he loses the knight. So he's just losing the knight. Interesting Susquehanna position. This is called a bind. All right, so back to the game. So now we can understand why the master just tried to kind of give it up here. He played rook on f to d2. And of course now black can just play bishop takes f1 and win the knight, which he does. Now white finally trades and he tries to double attack the bishop and the rook. Delen plays rook c1, going for rook c2, trading rooks with trivial endgame. White has not much to do. He plays g3, rook c2. Resigns is good. Now, of course, clearly king takes f1, rook takes d2 is no good. And rook takes c2, b takes c2, king takes f1, c1, queen is no good. So white just plays king e1. Black says, okay, I'm up a bishop, let's trade. He brings his bishop back to c4 to guard the b3 pawn and win the pawn on d5. And finally, white gives up the ghost and says, no mas. And my son wins. So I think that gave my son a score of 8 out of 11. And it brought his team up to second place, the Susquehanna International Group. So in the last round, my son got there were three teams in contention for first. I think I showed them earlier in the video. We can show them again. The three teams were SIG, Wells Fargo, and Deloitte. So in the last round, my son got paired with one of the Deloitte players who's higher rated than he is, and I'll show that game in the next video. It's another very instructive game. And again, these games are played at a very high level. The game you just saw today, this is a 15-10 game. It's being played at a fairly fast rate. So these are very high quality games played at a fairly fast rate. And even though my son missed knight takes e4 in the opening, anybody can miss that in a 15-10 game. I might be able to miss that in a 15-10 game. I hope I wouldn't miss it in a slow game. But in a 15-10 game, it's possible. And, after that, I really don't think I could have played much better than Delen did. And that hasn't been said too much. And what's funny is Delen hasn't played much in the last 20 years. He played up till about junior year in high school. And then he pretty much stopped playing. He still plays a little bit online here and there. But he wanted to play for his company. And if you look at the team standings here, if we go back for SIG, you can see they have an international master, Arthur Chen, on their team. They've got a national master, Eric Most. They have some experts. Brian Lowe, who had a great tournament, 10 out of 12, is an expert. William Chen, who's a member of our mainline chess club, is also an expert. And Delen's only 1747, but on their 15-man team, you can see he had the second best score. So he had this is the best tournament of his life, I think. At age 37, having not played for, much tournament chess for 20 years. I think his playing strength for this tournament was, very close to, I think it was over 2,100, or at least somewhere in that ballpark. All right, so I'm going to show you the last round game from the North American Corporate Chess League in the next video. If you like the video, you can hit subscribe, you can hit like, but even more importantly, tell your friends. We're trying to get to 100,000 hits on my YouTube channel, Dan Heisman Chess. So the more that know about it, the merrier. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.